They whispered it was the strangest wedding anyone had ever seen. An 85-year-old wealthy widow, dressed in diamonds, walking hand in hand with a man young enough to be her grandson. A 25-year-old stranger who appeared out of nowhere, claiming he loved her. Was it love? Was it manipulation? And in this story, the ending is nothing like you expect. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, her husband long gone, her only son estranged, her relatives scattered. What remained was her fortune, and a silence so thick it weighed on her every morning. Neighbors often saw her staring out of the grand windows of her estate, her jewels sparkling but her eyes hollow. To the world, she was untouchable, wealthy, powerful, intimidating. But behind those locked doors, Eleanor was nothing more than an old woman fighting against the loneliness of her final years. And then came him. A young man, no older than 25, first spotted tending the gardens of her estate. He was tall, striking, and carried himself with a quiet dignity that stood out in a town still scarred by generations of racial prejudice. His name was Samuel, and he was everything Eleanor's world had never allowed into its inner circle, poor, black, and invisible to people like her. But Eleanor noticed him. It began with brief exchanges, a smile as he worked in, the son, a thank you when he carried groceries. Soon, the wealthy widow and the struggling young man were spending longer moments together. And the town began to notice. Whispers grew louder, judgment sharpened, and neighbors started to ask questions. Why was the richest old white widow in town spending her evenings with a poor young black man? And why did she suddenly seem alive again? At first it was subtle. Eleanor would sit outside as Samuel worked in the gardens, asking him about his life, his family, his dreams. He spoke softly, often choosing his words carefully, as though years of being overlooked had taught him to hide parts of himself. He told her he had grown up in the poorer quarter of town, raised by a single mother who worked herself to exhaustion. He had no inheritance, no safety net, only his hands and his determination. Eleanor listened, truly listened, in a way few ever had. And something strange happened. The frail, aging widow who rarely left her house began to smile again. She walked lighter, laughed more freely, and even hosted quiet dinners where Samuel sat across from her at the long oak table once reserved for politicians and businessmen. The whispers in town grew into something sharper. She's lost her mind. He's just waiting for her to die and take everything. An old white woman with a young black man? It's a disgrace. In a community still shackled by unspoken prejudice, the sight of Eleanor walking arm in arm with Samuel was not just scandalous. It was a threat to the old order. People who once respected her now turned their backs. Invitations stopped arriving. Church pews that once welcomed her now felt colder, eyes drilling into her back with silent condemnation. But Eleanor didn't care. Or perhaps she pretended not to. For the first time in years she felt alive. And Samuel? He seemed to cherish her attention, her generosity, her belief in him. He accompanied her on walks, read to her in the evenings, and protected her from the loneliness that had once consumed her. Still, cracks began to show. When Eleanor offered to buy him new clothes, he accepted. When she suggested he leave the gardening to the staff and stay inside with her, he agreed. Slowly, Samuel's world became hers, and hers alone. Friends whispered that she was rewriting her will. Others swore they saw him driving her expensive car late at night. The town's whispers transformed into warnings. She's being used. She doesn't see it, and when she finally does, it'll be too late. Then came the wedding. Against all expectations, against every sneer and every whispered threat, Eleanor Whitmore, 85 years old, wrapped in pearls, stood before the entire town and declared her love for Samuel, a man 60 years her junior. The ceremony was small, but the shock waves were enormous. Newspapers ran the story. Old acquaintances cut ties completely. And beneath the surface, fury was brewing. Because while some saw a lonely widow clinging to love, others saw something far more dangerous, a young black man who had dared to step into a world never meant for him. And in towns like theirs, love was never just love. It was a battle line, and the war was only beginning. The marriage ignited a firestorm. Eleanor's estate, once a symbol of untouchable wealth, became the center of scandal. Former friends called her a fool. Businessmen whispered about legal action. Some even claimed she was mentally unfit and demanded a court intervene. But beneath the public outrage lay something far uglier. Anonymous letters began arriving at her doorstep, some mocking, others filled with threats. Samuel was followed. Whenever he went into town, men spat near his feet, muttering slurs as he passed. The sheriff, who once dined at Eleanor's table, now treated him like a criminal in waiting. Eleanor, frail yet defiant, clung to Samuel with a fierceness that unsettled even her staff. To her, he was her lifeline. To the world he was, a vulture circling his prey. And then, the rumors hardened into something more dangerous. Bank records leaked. Large withdrawals appeared in Eleanor's name. Gifts, investments, loans written out to Samuel. Jewelry vanished from the estate's vault. Her estranged relatives pounced, claiming Samuel had bewitched her, stolen her reason, drained her fortune. Court petitions were filed. Investigators circled. The story divided the town. Was Samuel a victim of prejudice, unfairly accused because of the color of his skin? Or had he truly found the easiest path into unimaginable wealth through the affections of a lonely, vulnerable old woman? The tension reached its breaking point on a stormy night. Neighbors swore they heard shouting echoing from the estate, her trembling voice, his low, urgent tone. The next morning, Eleanor failed to appear at her usual church service. By afternoon, the sheriff's car was seen in her driveway, and by nightfall, the town learned that Eleanor Whitmore was gone. Some whispered she had died quietly in her sleep. Others swore her death was anything but natural. Samuel insisted it was her failing health. But behind closed doors, no one could ignore the timing, the money, the secrets. The love story that had shocked the town had ended in a silence far darker than anyone imagined. In the days after Eleanor's sudden death, the town erupted with speculation. Her will, once ironclad, had indeed been rewritten, leaving a vast portion of her estate to Samuel. To her relatives, this was proof of manipulation. To others, it was evidence of love, that she wanted her last days of joy honored with generosity. But truth didn't matter. Perception did. And in a town still poisoned by prejudice, Samuel was guilty the moment Eleanor's heart stopped beating. He was dragged through courtrooms, his every action dissected. Lawyers painted him as a predator who had calculated his way into Eleanor's fortune. The press fueled the fire, splashing his face across headlines with words like gold digger and con man. Few cared to ask what Eleanor herself had felt, whether she had chosen freely to love and to give. Samuel never recovered. Even when charges of fraud failed to stick, even when no evidence of foul play was found, the damage was irreversible. He was branded forever, not as a man who had loved, but as a man who had taken. Friends turned away, jobs disappeared, his name became a cautionary tale whispered in disgust. And yet, in the quiet corners of town where truth hides, From the roar of judgment, some still wondered. They remembered how Eleanor's laughter had returned, how her steps had grown lighter, how her eyes shone in those final years. Could that be faked? Could a fortune buy that kind of joy? Or had Samuel been punished not for what he did, but for who he was, and who he dared to love? The mansion eventually crumbled into silence, its windows boarded, its gardens overgrown. Samuel disappeared, leaving behind a story that no one agreed on, but no one forgot. And perhaps that's the real tragedy, not whether Eleanor was fooled, but how a community's hatred and suspicion ensured that love, in whatever form it truly existed, could never survive. So ask yourself, was this the tale of a man who deceived an old woman, or the tale of a town that destroyed them both because it could not accept what it saw?